Okay, so what would you say if there was a sports team entitled the St. Louis Hicks? You probably have this impression, right? Well, what gives the American community, that is, the world around us with which we interact and communicate in, the authority to do this? However, with different ethnicities.
I was just wondering your opinion on like stuff in today's culture, like the the uses of Native American imagery in sports. This isn't really about our paper. I'm just
I
really
know.
curious.
Mostly native people find it as demeaning. You know, when you have your youngster look at something and shows a negative stereotype of your culture, what do you feel like? I have a little handout I give my students with football helmets. You know, how would you feel with Japs on it, or Wops on it, or Chinks on it, or whatever? You know, those are all negative stereotypes of other cultures. So why should Native people be different? Oh, well, we're honoring them. We're honoring them. Well, you know, when they don't feel honored, then
Yeah.
you should probably do something different.
Mhm.
You know, if you continue to do one thing and they say this is hurtful, then that's not very thoughtful. And
Yeah.
there are some people that say, oh, we have a lot worse problems we need to do, you know, let it go. And it's like, no, this
Yeah.
is something that is really very important. It is the base of how this American culture sees Native people as less than, because many times mascots are animals, so you're equating them with an animal. Now, the Seminoles have a working relationship with the Florida State University, I think it is.
Yeah.
And, you know, they do fine. They approve of what they do. But, you know, the tomahawk chop and the Redskins and some of those are just very, very negative.
Yeah.
Washington Redskins have had this mascot for over 70 years. However, the Native Americans are claiming it offensive and looking for a change soon. List of laws and acts imposed upon the Native Americans by the American government goes on and on. However, the one that we will be focusing on is the Dawes Act of 1887.
Really? Like, what consisted of the Dawes Act? Like, what did the U.S. government mean by putting in place the Dawes Act?
They wanted to take all of the extra tribal land from the Native people. They called it surplus. There was 138 million acres that was at stake. And from 1887 to 1934, 60% of that was taken from the natives.
Okay.
They planned to make them into Europeans. They wanted them to blend. They wanted them gone. They wanted them to be a part of America rather than separate.
Okay.
Clearly, this act affected the Native Americans greatly. However, the Americans didn't even think twice about it. All they wanted was more land. This land could be used for many things. It could give land to poor people, it could grow a lot of crops, and mainly just from flat-out greed from the American society.
You know, since you people are so young, you know, I don't know if you've ever heard of the land rushes. Well,
Yes.
for
Yeah.
Yes.
regular poor folks, it was a big deal because they got free land. All they had to do was claim it. The thing that they didn't mention a lot of times was the fact that it belonged to Native people first.
This land that the Europeans took was the Indians. However, they had a different relationship with their land than the Europeans. The Indians were the land, and the land were the Indians.
Yeah, it was their way of survival, and that it was a respect thing. This is a paper that I've got that I read to my own students. It's Who Are We? And one of the most difficult concepts for non-natives to understand is the fact that they are connected to everything. You know, we see ourselves as separate, but yet we do understand that everything reflects on everything else. You know, if there's a big problem here, you know, it leaks out onto the outskirts. But Native people saw that very, very closely. And they realized that if something was wrong with their environment, there would be something wrong with them. They had great respect for our not taking too much because there might not be something next year. So again, this was all a part of how they saw things so differently than the Europeans.
Yeah.
Now I ask you this. In knowing what we know about the Dawes Act and genocides, would you consider the removal of American Indians by the Europeans a genocide? Now I remind you of two things. The first being that the Dawes Act was not the only way of forcefully removing American Indians, and that the four themes of genocide are cult of antiquity, fetish for agriculture, ethnic enmity, and imperial expansion.
From 1887 to 1934, 60% of that was taken from the natives.
Okay.
They planned to make them into Europeans. What happens is the fact that Native people are very connected to their land. They feel that they're a part of it. We basically are connected to stuff. They are connected to land. You know, when you say, well, where's my home? Well, you give an address. They say, this was my home. Whatever you see was my home. I am a part of it. It was very difficult for them to go from a point of being a part of the land and a part of everything in their environment to being put upon as tenants, farmers, that they knew nothing about for the most part. Very few natives were farmers, especially those west of the Mississippi. What they hoped would make natives part of our melting pot. You know, that they would blend with the Americans, that they would be a part of it, but they were not going to be an equal part. Always they were a lesser part. Always they were thought of as children. Gosh, you know, I have land now. Well, the people that came from Europe were, for the most part, poor. And as such, they didn't own land because land in Europe was very expensive. Only the wealthy people had that. And then they set it out for people to work for them. So here, it was a possibility that they could have their own land. And that was a really big thing for people that were, you know, basically poor. Just to have your own farm for some of these people was a really awesome thing.
Yeah, so Mr. K, I don't really understand how this can be a genocide when it doesn't really have a very high death toll. Usually whenever I notice a genocide, it's like it during the Holocaust and there's a very high death toll, or in some place like Rwanda where there's a very high death toll. How could there be a high death toll when when the Americans were only relocating the American Indians? I think your question is a good one, and I think it brings up a good point. Class, do you think there needs to be a high death toll for a genocide to be noticed?
It was estimated that there were some 5 to 15 million native people on the North American continent. Okay, within a few hundred years, that was devastated down to, you know, less than half that. The diseases that the Europeans brought were the largest killers of native people. They had no way to fight it. So by the time they took a census in 1890, there were only 237,000 native people out of those million.
Kind of the miscomprehended thing about this, Austin, is that a lot of people did die, like a lot of Indians did die during this whole relocation process. And as you heard earlier, it wasn't just because of, you know, shooting or torture, it was mainly because of disease. The disease the Europeans brought to the Native Americans, they couldn't fight off. They didn't have medicine or anything we have today. So the miscomprehended thing here is that people did die. It wasn't just, you know, here we want your land so you can move. It was here we want your land, now fight for it. So, you know, as I think about your question, it gets more and more interesting with the large death toll. Is it needed for a genocide? You know, I just don't know. I really don't. So what I want you to do tonight is I would really enjoy if you researched that topic. I probably won't give you extra credit, but I think it would be interesting for next class.
Because they wanted the native people out of their hair.
So they just like wanted them out. They didn't.
Yes, if you stop and look at the process of how native people have been treated for the 500 years that Europeans came here, you see that it is a slow genocide. The only thing we have to compare that to is the Holocaust in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
You know, most native people believe that this was our own Holocaust.
Yeah.
You know, you can't purposefully take and take and take in little increments, many times, things away from a culture. You know, rather than calling them a race of people, they were just unique cultures of people. And it wasn't until the 1800s that actually people believed that they had souls, or that they were human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's much easier to take something from someone that's not human, or that's
Yeah.
not thought of as human, or not thought of as Christian, not thought of as having a soul like all these conquering Europe.
So clearly this topic is very controversial. As you saw, it's a genocide in the eyes of American Indians. However, in the eyes of the Americans and American government, it's a very controversial thing.
With that today, do you think the government does enough to kind of integrate the Native Americans with kind of everybody else today? Because they have the tribal reserves, and I kind of feel like that would just be putting them in one certain spot, not.
Well, that's what they
Leaving
did.
them.
They said they did it for their protection. Right.
Yeah.
So again, you know, well, that's wonderful to do, but why do you put them on the pieces of earth that nobody else really wants? But then, of course, when the coal was found and the gold was found and the silver was found and the oil was found, it's like, oh, we gave the wrong stuff to these guys.
Yeah.
You know, let's see how we can take it back. And, you know, if you research the story of the Black Hills was taken illegally. And the Supreme Court ruled in the favor of the natives. They gave them $105 million. And then by this time, they have not taken it because they want the land base.
So in the modern world, there's no doubt that we are exposed to Indians. However, it's in a false image, like the Blackhawks, the Braves, and like we said before, the Redskins. So before we jump to any conclusions about what we know about Indians, is it true what we do know, or is it false? So how does this all tie back to the American government? Well, I think the American government is the people. It is us. So it really all ties back to what we believe and what we know. What we know have been these false images of these American Indians. The contingent factor upon fully knowing this topic is contingent upon your definition of community. And it is different for everybody. Whether you know a lot about the American Indians or not, you can still have your own opinion as to the Dawes Act and the many acts that challenged the American Indians in a way that we wouldn't like ourselves to be challenged. Through ethnocentrism, we see these false depictions of many, many Indians, like the Blackhawk, the Redskin, and we see the Chiefs, and we see the Braves. So what does this tell us about our community? What does it tell us about us now? Is it saying that we have changed or that we haven't changed?
Hey,